Evin is an alumnus of Little Rock Central High School and the University of Arkansas. He is a former Democrat Gazette reporter who often wrote about public history topics. He currently works as an independent editor, consultant, and writer, and some of his articles about public history and sports have been republished in county historical journals, including the Pulaski County Historical Review. His passion for the intersection of athletics, race relations, and state heritage led him to write the book he will be talking about tonight. It's an anthology which was made possible through a Curtis H. Sykes grant, as I mentioned before, from the Black History Commission of Arkansas. He has joined the great area code 501 to 47 migration, 479 migration, and for the time being at least now resides in Rogers, Arkansas. Please help me welcome Evin Demirel.
Thank you, Danielle. So to start with, it's good to be home. I saw, I've done quite a few talks now since the book came out last summer, and I don't think I've had one with such a historically minded audience. So it's exciting to do this tonight. I too want to give thanks to the Black History Commission. Tiana's back there who helps run that. I want to give thanks to the Fred Dara Foundation as well, helping fund this. So I see a lot of familiar faces out there and folks I've met just this evening, and I really appreciate you guys coming out. As she mentioned, I'm a former reporter. I'm a Little Rock native, and I've been asked why I wrote this book about this topic specifically. And I'm no means an expert on African American history or culture. I don't pretend to be, but I care a lot about sports specifically. So I want to kind of start there. There we go. Okay, next. A little clicker thing. This one? Okay. So since childhood, I've been a huge football and basketball fan. And in particular, I've always followed the Razorbacks. In the 90s, as we know, Coach Nolan Richardson, Todd Day, Lee Mayberry, the rest of them took Razorback basketball to the mountaintop, and I felt a lot of pride from that vicariously, just like a lot of other Arkansans did as well. In the summer of 2014, I was the only Arkansas journalist to go up to Springfield, Massachusetts, and attend Richardson's induction to the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame. And that was a big one, and he was very generous with his time. The morning of his induction, he spent about over an hour with me in the hotel restaurant. And he introduced me to John Walker, the longtime Little Rock lawyer who defended him during his discrimination lawsuit against the U of A in 2004. But the focus on that day was not on the contentious aftermath to his career, but rather on his rise. And Nolan is a historic figure in a few ways. He is, in '85, when he came to Arkansas, when Frank Broyles hired him to Arkansas, he became the first basketball or football African American to coach in a major college in the Old South. Being the first on such a stage takes resolve and some serious guts, and he has never been short on that. I remember in the induction speech specifically that he had that night, he recalled his grandmother who raised him telling him, "You remember Jackie Robinson? You remember what he did?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." "You have to do the same damn thing. Crack of the door, son, is all you need. You can take care of the rest yourself. It's all about attitude. Force your attitude on the people that you deal with." So, I mean, talk about a direct line into why was this guy such a good coach and how did he get these guys to play so hard? I mean, that kind of quote kind of sums it up. But most of Nolan's pioneering, though, in the 60s and 70s before that was done in the state of Texas, in his home state. He broke barriers as a college player at what now is UTEP, and then as a high school and a junior college coach in that state. While Nolan has become an Arkansan, he was not a native son. Yet there was another inductee that summer who was a native son. His name was Nat Sweetwater Clifton. He became the second black man to play in the NBA and the first black all-star for the New York Knicks. He was part of the Great Migration of the 1920s, going from Lonoke County to Chicago's South Side. In the 40s, he teamed with El Dorado native Goose Tatum on a Harlem Globetrotters team that beat the all-white NBA champion Minneapolis Lakers. So that was a huge win for African Americans in general when that occurred. I had the honor of talking to Sweetwater's daughter and grandson at his posthumous induction that year. During one of the media scrums, I remember how out of place they seemed in a sea of celebrities, just them and a Hollywood director who for years has tried to bring Sweetwater's story to the big screen. They were so gracious and honored to be there on behalf of Sweetwater, who died in 1990 after decades of taxi cab driving and trying to get his pension from the NBA. He died, essentially he retired before there was a guaranteed pension for retired NBA players. Kind of want to go forward and into my background a little bit. I grew up in the Pine Valley area of Little Rock, central Little Rock. I always felt different from my friends because they had American parents. At least most of my friends, not all of them. So my father, meanwhile, is a native Turk, and he was often gone for work. His language sounded so different, and his points of reference seemed so foreign. There was no deer hunting or Little League baseball or frog gigging in my childhood, but there were neighborhood pickup games, football and basketball, eternal talk of the Razorbacks' fortunes, and those kinds of things helped me feel like I was one of a tribe. In the late 1990s, I attended Central High, and my classmates had their own title-winning powerhouse basketball program to be spoiled by. Those teams featured Joe Johnson, future NBA All-Star, and 3 other future Division I starters. As much as sports served as a common ground for discussion in our classes, so were conversations involving civil rights history. When I was a junior, we commemorated the 40th anniversary of Central High's integration, and that sparked a deluge of national attention that descended on our school just as the 60th did last fall. One of the things I have enjoyed the most in the aftermath of the book's publication is the opportunity it's given me to reconnect with my alma mater, Central High. And a lot of that has to be credit given to Jody Morris, who is kind of like the public outreach ranger at the Little Rock Central Museum, National Historic Site. And she's invited me to do a couple of events involving the museum. The first was a panel discussion at Central High for the student athletes, and me, Jay Jennings, who's another author, Johnny Greenwood. We have some of Johnny's guys right in front row here. I've met them tonight. And Eddie Boone talking about their experiences growing up in North Little Rock, growing up in Stuttgart, and they were the first black coaches at Central High as well. So the second was earlier last month, right here in Little Rock, and I was in a Q&A, I was able to moderate with the Olympian Tommie Smith. He is, of course, a 68 gold Olympic medalist in track, and Smith, as many of you will recall from the famous photo you see right there, raised his fist during the medal ceremony alongside fellow track star John Carlos, protesting on behalf, it should be remembered, of the Olympic Project for Human Rights, which advocated against racial segregation in the U.S. and racism in sports in general. Smith is not an Arkansan. He did grow up not too far, about an hour west of Texarkana, and then he moved to California, but his brave stance has had an influence on many Arkansans, as I heard through the testimony shared that day. I should add that one of the points of action his Olympic Project group pushed was the restoration of Muhammad Ali's world heavyweight boxing title after it was stripped from him in 1967 following his refusal to be drafted into the Vietnam War. Barred from boxing, Ali turned to the college lecture tour as a minister for the Nation of Islam. He was a black Muslim, or had publicly been one since 1964 after beating Arkansan Sonny Liston for the heavyweight title. And he spent nearly a week in Arkansas in 1969, going to Fayetteville, going to Pine Bluff, going to Little Rock. And in my book, I do a deep dive into that tour. I spend like almost 40 pages on it and the controversies that stirred up around the state. So these Central High related events were something I would have never expected to be part of when I was a student there. While I enjoyed history, at that age, I did not think of it as something that I could actually engage in. I was kind of passive, as maybe most high school students are. I thought it was just something that you learned about, you didn't produce it. At the time, I didn't even consider what public history was. It wasn't, maybe it was a term that was thrown around, but I didn't know what it meant, even though I had an outstanding teacher in Charlie Brown over there at Central High, who was a really good history teacher. And if someone had asked me what is public history, I thought it had to be something decided on and executed by professionals, accredited professionals. History seemed to be plaques, grainy video, and important dates in textbooks at that time. Back then, I had this sense of whatever it was one and the same with the institutions that conveyed it to present and future generations. And I've since learned that that isn't the case. One of the ways I learned it was, again, through the love of sports, and I'm going to get into why more in a second. But I want to provide some background. And to that end, I'll share one of the forgotten public history stories in my book. On the cover, you'll see reference to black Razorbacks. And some here will remember that when it comes to Razorback football, the likes of Darrell Brown and John Richardson are important black Razorback pioneers. They had their basketball counterparts in Lewis Bryant, in Almer Lee, and Thomas Johnson, who was one of the high school players under Eddie Boone in Menifee. He was a great basketball player out of Menifee, and he becomes kind of the first star for the freshman team, Razorback black player in 1967. And I dedicate a chapter specifically to Eddie Boone, his coach, and some of the amazing stories that he shared with me about being the first black coach in the Arkansas Activity Association, technically a year before it integrated. He was kind of unofficial at that point, but he was taking teams, this all-black team out of Menifee, up into the Ozarks, playing these all-white teams. Very interesting stories that he shared with me, and I really appreciate him opening up. In the last few months, I've met many Razorback pioneers. Some have sought me out after hearing about the book. Just last week at an event in Springdale, of all places, I had an illuminating talk with Greg Thomas, who in the mid-'80s became the Razorbacks' first black starting quarterback. Overall, his experience was positive, he told me, and to this day, he was attending an annual Razorback luncheon or alumni event with others. He wears the gear and everything. You can tell he bleeds Razorback red. He's native Texan, but he's a huge fan. But he also shared something with me that he said has been on his mind for 20 years. He's been writing about it, collecting his diary, and he wants to get it out off his chest. He said he got a lot of flack that first year he was the a quarterback that got significant playing time. That was 1984. The first time he appeared as a Hogs QB was in a nationally televised game versus Navy. Arkansas won the game, but when he returned to his dorm room after the flight to Fayetteville, he found his roommate had unplugged the phone. It had been deluged with hate calls and death threats from multiple people, which restarted whenever they plugged it back in. He couldn't believe it. It's like, plug it back in, surely it's not that bad. No, it really was that bad. And so many Arkansans just couldn't accept seeing a black man as the face of the program. He had to change the number about 3 times that fall. So that's kind of something that some insiders know about that happened to him, probably happened to Quinn Grover, who followed him as well, but just to hear it firsthand from him really made me, it was disturbing to some level. But he's persevered through it, and he has a really positive attitude. That's very heartening to see. These are the official black Razorback whose stories who have been at least partially chronicled till now. But decades before them decades before these pioneers were a group of young African American men, also called the Black Razorbacks by newspaper writers of the time. One reason I wrote this book was to bring their stories back into the public sphere and help provide recognition to them as pioneers in their own right. So let's go into them. Oh, before I get to them though, I keep teasing. Let's cover some basic background. So for one, this is the first known mention of African American athletes in the state of Arkansas. It comes to us from a Fort Smith newspaper, 1868, the Fort Smith Herald Weekly. And as you can see, it says, "We understand that boys, white and black, are much given to baseball on Sunday. To the annoyance of many persons in our city, in violation of the Sabbath, it should be stopped." So that's the very first reference. It's not surprising. It's in the context of baseball. Baseball, is no surprise to anybody, was the most popular sport for like a century, essentially, into the mid-1900s, if not later. Essentially, every community had a team, including those with pretty small black populations. So this is what surprised me when I live in Benton County now, and I was shocked to learn that Bentonville, of all places, used to have an African American community, and not one but 2 black baseball teams. in the 1910s. And I started looking into it a little bit more, and I realized there were other black baseball teams in the Ozarks in the towns that were near railroads, where they needed that labor in the late 1800s, and such as Neosho and Carthage in Missouri. So they did have local competition they could play against, not to mention farther south. Interracial baseball competition was fairly common in this era, the Jim Crow era. There was money to be made in the Major League Baseball. Dizzy Dean, the Arkansan, Satchel Paige, the great pitcher, led barnstorming teams that made all kinds of money for both guys. So it's not surprising to see that happening on the lower levels. There's just a lot more players who could do that. So it's likely these guys competed against whites. Far less common in the South was interracial competition in contact sports, like football. Indeed, at some point after Jack Jackson, the great black boxer, became world heavyweight champion in 1908, his home state of Texas created state law forbidding interracial competition in contact sports. But in a neighborhood in South Fayetteville, blacks and whites began scrimmaging against each other in football at least as early as the 1920s. By the late 1920s, they had formed a community football team which played in all black teams from places like Joplin, Fort Smith, and Russellville. We don't have any photos of these unofficial black Razorbacks in action, but we do know they wore hand-me-down uniforms from the all-white Razorbacks and the Fayetteville High Bulldogs, which was an all-white team that they scrimmaged. So here's what was found out about them. That illustration, by the way, my uncle drew. So that is only a year and a half old. It's not like we found that one illustration. He kind of gave him some information, and he did a really good job of drawing something. So my friends Caleb Hardwick and Jerry Hogan, a Fayetteville historian, helped me track down the only known detailed retrospect of this team. It was written in 1985 by a Fayetteville High grad named Arthur Freeman. It's all I know, it's just the byline. But from reading his retrospect, he was a Fayetteville High player around 1930, and he recalled the black Razorback second team scrimmaging the Bulldogs on the grounds of the segregated U of A itself. So volunteer Razorback coaches even trained them on the side while the Hogs head coach watched. When they played at the U of A's practice field, they got routed by the whites, according to Freeman. Things changed, however, when they played a few miles away in the black part of town. And I'm going to read Freeman's collection from my book now. Quote, "With the black maidens cheering them on from the sidelines, we didn't have a chance," unquote, Freeman recalled. "They dragged us up on one side of the field and down the other. The game usually ended when we were so battered that we didn't have anyone physically sound enough to continue the struggle." And he kind of talks more about getting his ribs cracked by one of the guys he went against, and a Fayetteville High starting fullback sidelined from 2 football games because of a bruised shoulder he sustained against scrimmaging these guys. But the coach never knew. And time passed, Freeman grew up, he became a teacher at some point, and he moved away from Fayetteville. He doesn't say it outright, but somewhere between those macho moments of long throws and rough tackles, he spent time getting to know his black friends. Society precluded any chance of them sharing a classroom, but they still felt free to build bonds through the football field. "I grew morally and spiritually as a result of playing with the black kids," Freeman wrote in '85. "It was easy to learn that the only difference between us was the pigment of our skins." So there's a elemental lesson to take from, why some of this, why we're looking into this as deeply as or at least why I am as deeply as I am, beyond just the passion. Many of the black Razorbacks were high school age young men. Fayetteville did not have an all-black high school. The population wasn't big enough in that town among African Americans, so it makes sense they would form their own community team in lieu of a school team. But in the southeast and central Arkansas, it was a different situation. There were many all-black high schools before integration, and from at least the early 30s through the mid-60s, they had their own statewide activities association. This association, which went by different names, here we see Arkansas Colored Athletic Association is the name, circa 39. Later it'd be known as the Arkansas State Athletic Association, existed parallel to the all-white schools Arkansas Activity Association. and they integrated in '66, officially, is when they started integrating, as far as the two associations. There's an enormous gap between, in the recorded public record when it comes to these two associations. And there are two main reasons for that. That's just another, that's one of the few like actual memorabilia we still have from the Colored Athletic Association. A guy named Jaleeve Grice, he was a Dunbar player at this point, but later he'd become a very famous, very renowned Pine Bluff photographer in the 50s through the 80s. He has his own book of photography, actually. And so he took a photo of that. So the two main reasons are, number one, newspaper coverage. From 2007 to 2010, I worked as a feature obituary writer and a general assignment reporter for the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, as you mentioned. Fortunately, I had these supervisors who allowed me to roam about and write about local history, and one of my favorite places to lose myself was in the morgue, the basement archives of the Democrat-Gazette. Rex, have you spent a little time in the morgue? Oh, yeah. Just a little bit. A great place, lively place. There in row after row of filing cabinets are tens of thousands of cutout articles dating back decades. Most of them were clipped from the Arkansas Democrat and the Arkansas Gazette, the state's two largest newspapers before they merged in 1991. Both papers, especially the Gazette, provided some coverage of the all-black sports team. So here's a Gazette article from 1954, I believe, and in it you can kind of get a sense of some of the schools that were in the biggest classification of the sports league. So if you can, I don't know if you guys can read it, but it does say right here, Conway, Morrilton, Coleman. Well, this is not the biggest. This is more the second biggest, but that is one of the examples of the articles that would come out in that time. I was shocked to find out that the Gazette in the 1930s, 20 years before this, printed an all-state, all-black high school football team and all-state, all-black college football team. It was experimental for a few years. They tried that out. On the whole, though, the coverage was scant. The lion's share of the coverage went to all-white schools, and that wasn't surprising given the advertising base for the papers were usually white-owned businesses. Meanwhile, some black communities did have their own papers. Perhaps the most well-known of these is the Arkansas State Press, an advocacy paper published by Elsie and Daisy Bates, who had become the Little Rock Nine's advisor and among many other accomplishments. Based in Little Rock, the State Press regularly covered high school and college sports. Indeed, one of its main sports writers is the now deceased Sonny Walker, from a former teacher at Man in the in the 50s. And he told me, before he passed away, stories of a hardscrabble field in southwest Little Rock, Saline County area. Which one is it? Is it southwest Little Rock or is it Saline County? Where was hardscrabble? So, you said what now? Hardscrabble. Yeah, was it in Little Rock or in Saline County? I've seen both. In Little Rock proper, southwest Little Rock. Close to Saline. Very close. Okay. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. Where local black baseball teams used to welcome barnstorming visitors like the likes of Jackie Robinson included among them. So speaking of the great Jackie Robinson, this past weekend, Major League Baseball celebrated a day in his honor. Every year they do this. Every day we talk more about what it means, and the decline of black baseball is one of the focuses of the book. But how great would it be to find the 80 and 90-year-olds who actually played with him or watched him play right here in Central Arkansas? I hope some of them are still alive. Chronicle their memories before it's too late. I know there are Arkansans who would take this work up, and I hope to find them through speeches like this and through digital heritage projects I've started. And I'll get more to those projects here in a few minutes. Despite the writing of Sonny Walker and others, the State Press's capacity to chronicle black school events was dwarfed by the Gazette and the Democrats' capacity to chronicle news involving white schools. And the difference is in orders of magnitude. Kind of get into some of those numbers right now. Consider the total number of years that the Gazette and the Democrat were both in operation, plus the 27 years since their merger, totals 312 years. By comparison, the State Press was published for a total of 31 years. On top of that, the Democrat, the Gazette, and the Demgaz have published daily, whereas the State Press published weekly. Finally, for socioeconomic and population reasons, each of the white-owned papers dwarfed the State Press in terms of sheer number of pages produced per issue. So a Sunday Democrat Gazette, for instance, may run more than 100 pages, but each state press issue chimed in at 8 pages. And so white newspaper coverage is one reason for the huge chasm in the public history record between all black and all white schools. Another is the fact that the high school sports records were not and have not been integrated yet. And I've been writing on this for years, and guys before me like Wadey Moore have been researching this for years, and they're still not integrated. So today, if you open the official record book of the Arkansas Activity Association, you'll see state champions listed in all major sports dating back to the early 1900s. Previous to '66, however, all the listed champions reflect what were then all white schools. Same goes for the most part with any individual or team records previous to the '66 integration. Based on the official record book, it's as if, for the most part, these all black schools never existed. So this is not an oversight, by the way. Today, the AAA well understands the issue, and one of its former record keepers, Wadey Moore, spent years trying to track down the records of the all black schools. The problem is that many of them have been lost or destroyed. When schools integrated in the '60s, it was usually the white schools which remained standing and the black schools which were raised or turned to junior highs or elementary schools. It takes a significant investigation to find out what happened to the yearbooks, the pictures, the trophies, and the records housed in these smaller black schools. Some were put into storage and private residence, and tracking down which private residence has which relics is a challenge. It takes time, it takes resources to pull this off. Fortunately, the Black History Commission has lots of leads. It has given grants to the projects involving the alumni associations of some of these schools. And I just heard tonight from Stacey Hirsch herself that there's a man out of Pine Bluff who's trying to get a traveling exhibit involving these pre-segregation integration schools as well going in Arkansas. So there's some movement there and there's some leads. But while the alumni associations are dwindling in number, and a lot of the alumni associations have produced work, it's just in paper form, physical form. It's not out there online or anything like that. They are still around right now for our students and researchers to collaborate. It's not too late. This should be a golden age for oral history projects involving Arkansas sports heritage. For one, many of the men and women who were adults in the 40s through the early 60s are still alive and they're ready to share. They want their memories to be passed on. Secondly, many of the Gazette, Democrat, and state press articles dating back as far as the 20s are now available online for public consumption, for searching for the digital first students through sites like genealogybank.com. By researching the articles, it should be possible, just from a sports perspective, to compile a year-to-year list of these all-black school state champions pre-integration. That could be done retroactive. I haven't actually sat down to do it myself, but someone could do it if they wanted to. Such a compilation would be a welcome supplement to the official record as it now stands. So what's the next step? I think it's to find interested students and researchers who see the urgency in commemorating the heritage of minorities in Arkansas. Since so many of these students have a digital-first mentality, the challenge is making what's already been collected in physical form available online to all. For instance, Scipio Jones in North Little Rock already has an amazing collection of memorabilia which needs to be digitized. Belinda Burney right here has welcomed me in to, she supervises the Alumni Association over there, and she's welcomed me in to see some of this memorabilia, and it is amazing. So many things that are missing for the other schools, Scipio Jones still has, and they've preserved it. And that's something that could be of immense value if it were made more available for others to learn from. Here are some pictures from that museum in the Alumni Association. So I'm gonna go and pop that up. Oops. Okay, so here is one of the trophies from 1926, a track trophy. Here is a Pulaski County Champions, and this was, until Belinda showed this to me, I didn't even know there was such a thing as Pulaski County. I'd never, of course, read about it. No one told me about it, but she showed this to me. There was a older gentleman, Joe Hale, who was there. Russell Hawkins, older gentleman. They kind of helped explain that to me. And you can notice it was on wood, by the way, in the 1940s. Girls Tournament, Little Rock, 1942. So that's something I wasn't able to get into as much in my book, was the female athletic heritage, but these kinds of souvenirs, the gap can be filled. You know, the information is there. Track and field. And they've done a great job of collecting some of the old photos, roster names. Here's a bowling team. Here's a female Dragonettes squad. And these are some impressive trophies that were won kind of on a national scale. So you get a sense of some of the. This was a second place trophy nationally that Scipio Jones won in a basketball tournament led by Eddie Miles, the great Eddie Miles basketball player. So you get a sense of what's out there, and Belinda herself is like trying to get schools to come by and tour this, and she's open to just tagging these photos. Like the effort of going in here and tagging them correctly, that in itself is something that needs to be done. And it's not just Scipio Jones. I met a guy named James Banks, who was a longtime basketball coach in Marianna, Arkansas, in Lee County. And James Banks has this kind of thing in his own home, and he wants to make it available to the public or the alumni, whoever, but he's not technologically savvy. And so when I said, can I have some images, he didn't know how to do it himself, but he got someone to come in, a policeman actually at a school, at the Lee High School, and the amateur photographer took photos, about 80 photos, and they are up there in a Dropbox right now, ready to be archived and categorized and so forth. So I know firsthand that there's a lot of will to see something like this done, but the form in which I think it should take, or we're pushing toward, is why the Butler Center and I have teamed up to create 2 related digital history projects. So the first one is comprehensive, and it relates to all the memorabilia involving all black schools across the state. It's not just sports specific. Sports is just the Trojan horse to get students interested. Okay, so here's the first one that we've set up here. George West, who's the public outreach officer at the Butler Center, and I are both helping with it. Here's one of the interesting things we've done is found. This is through the Black History Commission has a document that lists all black secondary schools from the 1930s, and there's over 160, and as many as we know are listed here. So you can just kind of go down every single county. On the left side, we've tried to fill it out as much as we can. There are blanks for the elementary schools and the primary schools. So a lot of those are just, I don't know, but I'm hopefully that we can kind of crowdsource this knowledge as people start contributing. But it is right now on a kind of a pilot website. If you were to go to this Arkansas History Hub, you couldn't find it if you looked around, but if you take note of this website, you can go directly to it. And it should be made public. I mean, it is public, you just have to go directly to arkansashistoryhub.com/Black Schools Project. Okay, so that's where we're going. Well, sorry, over 125 at this point, but we're trying to, there may be more out there. So that's where we're going with the comprehensive Black Schools Project, and then there's a more specific Arkansas Athletic Heritage project that's out through the same site. This one is more educational, meant for the students, and we have some actual lesson plans that have been created by professional educators. So just to show you an example of one. So Dustin Seaton, who's a specialist up there in Northwest Arkansas, who's lived in Pine Bluff and Little Rock as well, created this one, and it's kind of an interdisciplinary way to get students engaged with looking at civic issues and constitutional rights, but through the lens of some of the issues that Muhammad Ali's tour elicited when he was in Arkansas. So there's, I don't want to get too deep into it right now, but we have GT lesson plans, we have English lesson plans, reading comprehension for the youngest middle school, and then we have these more high school level type social studies or interdisciplinary lesson plans there, and they're all free, by the way. So all you have to do is go to ArkansasHistoryHub.com, and you can find them there. It's on the right side. You can see the link. The Little Rock School District and the Pulaski County Special School District are both using the book on a pilot program basis and some of these lesson plans in their classes. So trying to get the word out to more school districts about this resource. If you're interested, you can reach out to me. I'd love to talk more about any of this with you guys we can't address it in the Q&A afterward. And that's my contact information. By the way, Pinnacle View Middle School had me a couple of weeks ago and went over there and talked to those kids. It was really cool, and I saw them making drawings of Sweetwater Clifton off the book, and that was really special to kind of see that. And Pulaski Heights is going to have me in a few weeks, and that's my alma mater on the junior high level. So I'm excited to kind of get out there and talk to some of those middle schoolers as well. But I want to kind of wrap it up here, and then we'll get into the Q&A. One of the lesson plans that you saw was about the Scipio Jones High School the basketball dynasty of the late 50s, led by Eddie Miles, one of the greatest prep players our state has ever produced. I know it's time to wrap, but I want to make one point about Miles. In the early 60s, he almost became the first black basketball player after the former Hogs coach Glenn Rose recruited him. And before that, growing up in the 50s, he told me he had played both football and basketball and looked up to local schoolboy sports heroes like the great Bruce Fullerton, who was an All-American running back out of Little Rock Central, which was at the time the #1 ranked program among all white schools in the entire country, a dynasty in its own regard. Fullerton, a white man, played with and against all-white teams, but to Miles that didn't matter when he was listening on the radio. That didn't matter at all. He wanted to be like Fullerton anyway, because he saw and he respected a greatness that transcended skin color. So I just want to say I don't view heritage as a zero-sum game. I don't think it's a contest here. That's why I spend some of my book telling stories about whites like Cardinals pitcher Dizzy Dean, who played with and against blacks. Some of these guys were pioneers in their own right. And by learning more about what blacks have achieved in the past, I don't think whites lose their own history if they choose to think about the past in those kinds of terms. And the same thing goes for blacks learning more about what whites have achieved. Of course, if you start looking deeply enough, you'll find our histories aren't so separate after all. Thank you very much.